James Parr. I mean, wonderful, firstly, to see you again. What I'm really keen to discuss with you today is that there is this interface between the world of sustainability and what some now call the regenerative economy and space. And partly that's been around for quite a while in satellite remote sensing and things like that. But I think you're a peculiar creature in the sense that you straddle these different worlds. So just to kick us off, I imagine there's a sort of narrative thread that runs through your life to date. And I did see that you created a game for younger people in the 1990s featuring space. So it sounds like that has always been a part of who you are, your makeup. But how did it happen?
It has been. And I think I was, absolutely the child of Apollo. And I think a lot of us born in the 70s sort of have that in our DNA. And so, yeah, I've been dancing in and out of, the space business for a while. But the thing is, you can't think about space without thinking about the pale blue dot. And I was very aware of Carl Sagan and those concepts, even as a young man. And so really, I think it was, thinking about climate, thinking about planetary limits, those sorts of things that made me realize that perhaps a space career wasn't for me. And so when we met, which was 20 years ago or so, I think I was very much a greenie at that point. I was working for green parties and trying to sort of figure out how to make the world more sustainable. And space was sort of a forgotten dream. It was part of me, but it was something I didn't think was possible to have as a career. When I went to my first space conference, I was still working for green parties. Back then, certainly in the new space business, it was, these conferences are pretty small. And I went for dinner with a whole lot of astronauts and cosmonauts, and it was just, toe curling as I went down the table. And it was like, I'm bloody impossible, I have world record for space trip, all that sort of stuff. And everybody was, had spent time in space. And then it came around to me, and I was literally just felt, I just wanted to shrink away. I said, well, I'm a sustainability consultant. And they all lit up and they were like, well, we're here for the same reason.
How did they understand that? How did they understand their presence and activity as linking to what you were bringing to the table?
I think because all of them had spent time in space looking down the pale blue dot.
Yeah.
And so that concept, even though it's separate in daily life here, this is the notion of planetary limits and space are intrinsically linked for people who've been up there. And that this is, for me to say that was completely obvious that I should be at the table with them. And of course, they're all brilliantly urbane and charming and made me feel comfortable. And that's what astronauts do as well. They wouldn't be astronauts if they couldn't,
rub along with each other.
Exactly. And so, but I was very grateful, and it was a very special moment.
Well, it's funny because I can still remember the time when we suddenly, as a species, saw our planet from outside. And I can't remember who it was 40 to 50 years prior to that who had said at that moment something would change in the human psyche. I think the paradigm has been shifting, but by God, these things take a long time. And so maybe it does take 50 or 60 years before people really wake up to the reality which was signaled then. I think we're at one of those moments where people are criticizing. I think Prince William did it most recently. The new breed of billionaires and multimillionaires, Branson and Bezos and Musk and so on, who want to go into space and colonize Mars and so on. How do you think of all of that? I mean, do you think it's a complete waste of the species' treasure, or do you think there's some benefit lurking in there somewhere?
Well, it's got a huge symbolic value to criticize them. I think that's justifiable. I think we can safely say that the very, very wealthy have too much resource, and that resource would be better spent figuring out how to manage our planet better. However, I'm not sure if space itself is the target, as opposed to the billionaires spending the money on space. I mean, for example, with Blue Origin, which has got a lot of attention recently, and And perhaps rightly so. Perhaps joyrides for billionaires isn't a great use of resource, but they are building rockets. The new replacement of the F1, which is the rocket engine, which was on the Saturn V, and Blue Origin sort of pulled this out of the Atlantic Ocean. The plans for it had long since been lost, and they rebuilt this engine. And it's essentially burns clean. It burns liquid hydrogen. The byproduct is water. America doesn't have an engine like this for, access to orbit. So Blue Origin is really leading the charge for low emission rocketry. And this is, of course, all of the spin-off benefits of space investment. And the case for space is very difficult to make. NASA is an economist, and he figured out that for every dollar of taxpayer money spent, the US has benefited from about $14 of value. So that's just how the space business investment in NASA has returned to the US economy. And it's everything from the CMOS sensors in your smartphone to even the silicon chip itself. The first PC was actually the Apollo guidance computer, which was sat behind the heads of the astronauts on the way to the moon. And even Unix, which of course the entire internet is based on modern computing, was developed through this process, this sort of error-free software architectures that we now take for granted.
How do you put a price, though, on, or a value perhaps, on our ability to see our world and what we're doing to it from outside? I imagine that's priceless, but how do you think about that?
The story of the astronauts and the overview effect, again, has the emotional pull, and there's nothing more amazing than those shots from the International Space Station by Ron Garan, which show flying across all these countries and no borders, and showing how small and fragile it is, and the fact we can fly around it in 90 minutes, which again just kind of, it's very difficult for the human brain to conceptualize things outside a sort of 8-kilometer radius, which is what we've evolved to sort of hold in our RAM, so to speak. But the fact we can fly around our planet in 90 minutes shows its finiteness. And also the thing they mentioned about how small the atmosphere is, like it's literally the skin on an apple. But I think there's more to it than that, because of course space allows us to measure our planet with all of these different tools, multispectral cameras, radar. There's some huge variety of technologies now, and it really gives us a sort of independent, unequivocal measure of actually how the world is changing. When you can't argue with measuring the heat energy from the planet from space, like this is something for even the most fervent climate deniers. It's pretty hard to argue with that, to show the world is actually heating up when you look at it from a distance. And I think this new era we're in, where we're actually starting to observe our planet in extreme detail every day using these different tools, radar, optical, hyperspectral. This allows us to give us the toolbox to really understand how to measure our planet.
And how confident are you that our species, will use these tools, these technologies, these vantage points to the right end? I mean, we've just recently seen the Chinese demonstrate, partially at least, a hypersonic nuclear glider, and we all know that pretty much most of the space effort came from a race between the United States and the Soviet Union for the commanding heights of space. We tend, because you and I are people who've interested in sustainability and the art of planet management, as Bucky Fuller would once have called it, we tend to think that that's where it's going to go. But how do we know?
It's a good question, because of course our current behavior is not suggesting that it's going in the right direction.
No.
We're treating low Earth orbit the same way we're treating our oceans. So it's the tragedy of the commons. It's a place to pollute without really any sort of consequence. I think this is the era we're now in, that we now need to understand that when there's a commons, we need to work together to make sure that these things, these very finite things, aren't ruined. And there's a very real possibility that if there's more devices, there's collisions, there's even more military testing, that we may not ever be able to leave our planet, like the rain of metal. This is the Kessler syndrome, makes it impossible for us to actually navigate those small windows through low Earth orbit. And then, of course, there's the moon as well. That's also a commons, even though the volumes seem enormous. So did the ocean once upon a time. Actually, there's only a handful of places sort of in cislunar space, which describes the Earth-Moon system, where it's useful for human science. And so I think we do need to be much more circumspect about, how to have an end of life for these missions, which is, they age gracefully, they're deorbited, or they're reused, or that we find a way of actually applying, the principles of sustainability to this, to space as well as Earth. If you look through sort of centuries, 400 years ago, we thought as far as a village. And then 300 years ago, we started thinking a sort of continental scale. And you could argue that in the 20th century, we discovered we were global and we started thinking this global scale. In the 21st century, I think there's a transition where we're starting to think in sort of orbital terms, in terms of the solar system. And this is one of the things I really enjoy about this moment we're in now. Like we can think about the solar system as a place for science and exploration. There are no limits. We're limited, to going to stars, but that may be something for the century after. Mm-hmm. But for the moment, we have the next 80 years of this century where we have this incredible playground and infinite resource. The sun has more energy in a second than the human beings would need in a year. And if we are able to use space resources in the sun and all the water that's on asteroids, then perhaps we have a chance.
One of the projects you did recently looked at the interface between the space industry in a way and its trajectories and the sustainability agenda. At the end of that, what did you conclude?
If we're going to mature as a species, it's coming of age in the Milky Way, we can't take the way that we've been behaving, this sort of teenage adolescence, as we mature, into the stars. This is the moment which we need to stop behaving like that. And so I'm sort of hoping that as we mature as a species and as we figure out how to better manage our home, our planet, we take that way of acting, into the future and into the solar system and beyond. And by the time we actually do reach other star systems, we're a much wiser species. And I mean, it's interesting because it's in Carl Sagan's Contact, isn't it?
Yeah.
And at the end, she goes, the question I'd ask is, how did you do it? How did you get through this period of technological adolescence without destroying yourself? This is the biggest question we have. And at the moment, we haven't got the answer. I'm optimistic that if we can, and we do become a spacefaring civilization, that we can be wiser and be much better at managing our ascendance and our resources and, be the best that we can be.
Thank you immensely for what you do.
Oh,
thanks for sharing elements of that
today. I always love chatting to you. It's always a pleasure. Take care.